Hello, welcome to the Brave Writer podcast. I am Melissa Wiley, and my co-host Julie Bogart is out today. So I have a very special guest with me for today's conversation, which is going to be all about homeschooling teens, especially around books, reading, what teens are reading, what teens want to read, how to discuss books with teens, all sorts of things like that. So I am joined by Dawn Smith, who is Brave Writer's Director of Publishing. And Dawn, in addition to being my editor on the darts that I write for Brave Writer, Dawn is the person who picks the books for all of the programs, the dart, the arrow, the boomerang. Dawn put together our slingshot book lists over the years. And and the quills. Dawn and I worked closely together on those quills. That was some of our most fun collaboration, I would say. Would you agree, Dawn?
Absolutely.
Oh, I just put you on the spot. What if you didn't agree?
Well, I do. The quills were fun. And that word fun, we don't just throw it around lightly.
Because if you did disagree, that would be a great segue into the larger topic of how do we navigate conversations with our teens about books and why we want them to read certain books and what happens when there are books that they want to read that make us uncomfortable and all sorts of this big picture of our homeschooled teenagers and the books that they read.
That leads me to think of the word nuanced, because my fun with the quill is nuanced in I really, really enjoyed the reading and writing parts of the quill, but the math part was a struggle for me. So like everything, and especially when we are engaging with our teens, it is nuanced. There aren't always, really definitive answers either way. And I think we're going to get into some of that in this conversation. And by the way, I love teens. I taught high school. And I have always just adored hanging out with teens. And so whenever I get the chance to talk about teens, I have an affection for them and for parents who are homeschooling them.
Well, I know part of what we get to hear about today is some of the ways that you and Dylan, how old is Dylan right now?
So he's 19. He's
19. Okay.
He's
Still
going to his second year university.
A teenager, but right, at university now. The ways that the two of you handled your reading together and your discussions around books together. So I'm excited. And then, of course, I've had a whole bunch of teens myself and still have two. So this is great. And what inspired this conversation? I was so excited when I was like, Dawn, what are we going to talk about on the podcast? And you said, well, I have been getting questions from parents about teens, specifically around this teens writing, teens reading. And so you put together this great list of parent questions, and we're going to tackle some of those.
Yeah.
So, awesome. Well, gosh, I referenced your buddy reading system with Dylan. And I know that you had questions that you get from parents about teens reading on their own versus reading aloud. So, it may be that we're doing a boomerang. And, the book that my kid is going to read is a boomerang title. And we're going to do a lot of the discussion together. But is that still a read aloud, or am I handing that book over? In fact, a lot of teens kind of navigate their own way through the boomerangs, I know. And even so, stepping away from boomerang titles, just all of the books that our teens are reading that we're asking them to read. So I think that's the starting point, is I want you to read this book. And are we reading aloud to them still? Are they reading everything on their own? What's your take on this, Dawn?
There are so many ways to go about it. It depends on the book. It depends on the teen. It depends on, so many different factors. I remember when I was teaching high school, I was teaching in Southern California. We got the chance to go see Jim Trelease of the Read Aloud Handbook fame. He was giving his final public lecture.
Oh my gosh, you were there?
I was there. I was there at his absolute final public appearance. And so some teacher friends and we drove down to go see him. And this was before I had kids, mind you.
I don't know that anybody had a bigger influence on my decision to homeschool than Jim Trelease. I read his book, The Read Aloud Handbook, in graduate school. And I was like, read aloud culture was in my blood before I even had kids, right?
Yes.
Then
Yes.
it was, I mean, read aloud culture is a gateway
It
to
really is.
homeschooling.
It really
Okay, so I'm loving
funny.
this. Go
Okay,
ahead.
so we're here, and we're, of course, a lot of people when you think about reading aloud, everybody gravitates toward this idea that you're just reading aloud to little kids, and you're reading aloud to them before they become proficient readers. So he really shifted and shaped my ideas about reading aloud very early on in terms of reading aloud to kids who can read on their own. Thank you, please do that. Um, and even to teens. And he told this story about how when his kids became teens, they got really busy and their read aloud time, he was like missing their read aloud time. So while his teens were doing dishes, he would sit at the kitchen table and read articles from Time magazine to them so
That's
that
right.
he could like have something to read to them and have this current events discussion with them and things like that. And that just stuck with me in terms of continuing to read aloud to teens and having it be a time of connection and being able to read and pause and talk about the reading and really have a moment with them to continue to do that until they head off and they're away, and you don't always have those moments. So when it comes to deciding kind of like what to do about books and teens, there are some books that you could continue to read aloud together and your teen might be really into it. There are some books that they are going to definitely want to read on their own, not with you,
Right.
because and we might get into this a little later, but maybe it's a book about a topic that is a little more touchy and they're not ready to like live in process have those conversations with you. Maybe they need to read it, process it, and then come back around and have conversations about whatever the topic was. It could be all kinds of different topics. Or maybe it is a chance for an audiobook where everybody's listening together, but it's not necessarily the parent doing the reading aloud. There's like, you're triangling in another narrator. We did that with Project Hail Mary and The Martian and like lots of other books and short stories, like the Lovecraft short stories and things like that. We've done a lot of audiobooks. And then another thing that this kind of leads into is buddy reading, which is reading a book at the same time your teen is reading the book, but not necessarily reading it together at the same time. So you're not reading aloud, but you say, okay, well, on Friday we're going to have book discussions. We're going to get together and talk about the first 3 chapters in the book. So let's both have read it by then. Some teams want their own book so they can scribble in the margins, highlight things without you seeing. So you get 2 copies. We did 1 copy and we would just trade off. And we always did sticky notes. So we had little book tabs and Dylan would have, maybe blue or green and I would have the pink and purple. And we would mark parts that were interesting that we wanted to come back to and discuss together.
Fantastic system. Wow. We've had things where like we had one notebook that we would jot things down and the notebook would kind of travel with the book. Or if we each had our own copy, we, could jot down notes while each of us was reading so that we wouldn't forget when we came back. I love that you started with Jim Trelease because the reason that he made such a big impression on me was exactly what you talked about. Like, oh, right. Many of us, our experience as kids was we were read aloud to until we learned to read. And then you're on your own with books. And I remembered that in 5th grade, my teacher read us the Chronicles of Narnia, and like a grown-up hadn't read a book to me in years at that point. And it was so wonderful. Now, I think in subsequent years, teacher read-alouds came back into the classroom more than when, my early years in school. But Jim Trelease's book tapped into that memory for me, and it really informed things for us. I've shared on the podcast before about how, like, when Scott reads Watership Down, he's read that to all of our kids. And each time he would go, it's now been a few years and he's reading it to the next kid down the line. The older ones would demand to be part of it to the point where when he's reading it to our youngest, there were 3 like college age kids in the hall listening because they didn't want to miss it.
Right.
Scott and I shared read alouds with each other when we were newlyweds. That piece of like, experiencing the words of the book out loud together, it does infuse the reading experience with this special, well, nuanced, like you said before. You hear things differently when somebody's reading it versus what you, especially like there might be things that you tend to skip over in your own private silent reading.
Right.
I'm in a book club now with adults, and we meet on Zoom once a week. In fact, Julie's in it too now. It's so fun.
So fun.
And each week, we've all read the book. You know, we're showing up and we've read whatever Joan Didion essays or whatever chapters of Middlemarch were on deck for this week. We've done the reading. But during the session, the leader calls on people to read passages out loud.
Nice.
And you do hear things that you've missed before. So
I think it really speaks to the idea of even just the tone that somebody uses when they're reading something. The energy or the feeling that they put into it is maybe different than the way you read it. And that definitely comes through in some of the classics, some of the, older books, or a genre that your teen isn't typically reading. Maybe they're going to hear it differently in their own mind, but then they hear somebody read it out loud and it comes through differently.
Right. And sometimes especially if it's a really big book, a thick book, right? That's going to take it, like realistically, if you were to read it out loud, it could take you a year.
Right.
There are some books, like if you want to read Middlemarch out loud. Well, I know how long it took us to listen to Emma as an audiobook, like
right.
a long haul. So one strategy is sort of the hybrid, read aloud or do an audiobook to kickstart it. And that can really help kids, especially if the names are challenging or there's challenging vocabulary or syntax. Like it gets the cadences of the language into your ears. Or if it's a book that you think they're less enthusiastic about, read until a point where you know they'll be hooked.
Yeah, that's so helpful to just jumpstart that and to you basically lower this barrier of them getting into it. So especially for older books, you're acquainting them with the language. Like you said, there's syntax issues, there's cadence, there's the way things are pronounced, there's character names, especially if it's from a culture that you're not used to,
Right.
you're not as familiar with. And so it gives them some hooks to kind of feel more comfortable and to settle in a little bit when they hear that in audio or somebody reading it aloud, and then they'll kind of run with it. It's kind of like kids who, even younger kids who are resistant, and then you start reading a book aloud and all of a sudden you have to hide it from them because they're going to go run off and read it, but spoil it for their siblings.
Right. And you can also like get some narration woven into it really organically this way, because if it's a book that you start off reading aloud together or listening to on audio together, and then they run with it and they continue on, and now you're the one who's hooked and is behind, and they get to fill you in and letting them recap the story for you that way. I mean, really, kids of all ages. I know we're focusing on teens, but that's an amazing skill to be able to summarize a story, and it's going to also tell you what is sticking with them, and it's going to suggest discussion topics. They're going to happen organically in the course of this.
Well, and that kind of comes back around to this idea. Parents do ask, if I'm, say, doing a boomerang or slingshot, especially if it's a book that they want to, quote unquote, study with their teen, do they need to read it? And I always suggest that the parent at least read it on their own if the teen is reading it alone, because it gives the parent something to, their own things that they can bring up in natural conversations. We spend time doing dishes side by side or some other chore or driving together. And if you have those characters and that plot and some of the themes of the book knocking around in your brain, then it's really easy to come up with things to talk about. But then at the same time, you might say, I'm not there yet. Catch me up. Just give me your impression of, what's coming. I don't mind spoilers. Go ahead and tell me what's coming, and, I'll catch up. And then it gives you a chance to see kind of like where your teen's at and what they're taking away from the story and what's really hooking them and what's interesting to them.
Right. And it can even become almost a reverse of the way the passages are presented in the boomerang, where, you've selected passages that are going to be the jumping off points for discussion, but your teen can come back to you with like, oh, I want to look at this passage together.
Yes.
Whether you have or haven't read to that point in the book.
Absolutely.
They can
Yeah. Well,
recap
it's a
you.
really great chance for them to also take some ownership of, selecting things that they, discussion points they want to talk about. Before we leave like the general topic of reading aloud, I do want to say that Jim Trelease also inspired me to study children's picture books with my high schoolers. So I actually did a unit with my high schoolers where of course, it says something about me that I had an entire collection of children's picture books before I had kids.
Oh, me too, Dawn.
I
Me
don't
too.
know what that says about me. But I remember one day when I decided to kick off this unit, I just brought in this huge stack of picture books. And you should have seen the faces on these teens. They were purely delighted to revisit picture books that they had read when they were younger, to be introduced to new picture books, and then to study them in a way that they didn't when they were younger. They really got to be analytical about them and got to really dig into the structure and how some of them are repetitive and some of them, just like all the different nuances of picture books and studying those with teens. It was pure delightful interaction. And I had kids come back years later talking to me about that unit.
Oh,
So
I love that.
do not
Yeah.
discount, those kinds of things with your teens. And in fact, like fairy tales, and Julie and I are talking recently about how, people do their PhD, dissertations on fairy tales, and
Right.
so many things to dig into there. So that's another aspect of reading aloud, is that sometimes when you're revisiting, like you said, your older kids coming back and listening to those stories that they heard when they were younger. And when you revisit stories, and I think we've done a whole
We did about rereads.
rereads, you bring a whole new sensibility to it. And teens can bring a whole new sensibility to some of the stories from their younger years that they're revisiting.
I'm a huge advocate for bringing picture books into play for people of all ages. I mean, you're really never too old for a picture book.
Yeah.
And I'm going to put in my little side note about picture books. I have often encountered parents whose kids were becoming fluent readers and were trying to steer them toward reading, like quote, real books, middle grades or something, away from picture books. And so the vocabulary in picture books is actually a higher reading level than what is in typical, especially beginning readers.
Right.
And I write picture books, early readers, and middle grades. So, I know what the sort of path is there.
Because picture books are intended to be read aloud. So the idea is that the adult is going to be reading this. And think about the rich vocabulary that's exposing kids to.
Right. So,
also the vocabulary and the structures that other people get to analyze and really dig into is really interesting.
I also think that picture books are a really great, starter course for any kind of science or history topic that you might want to be diving into.
Mm-hmm.
To have that visual and have it presented in such a tight, finite format is a really good entry point. And again, for kids of all ages. I use it myself when I'm learning about something. I'll go see, what picture books are there on this topic?
I love that.
I'm glad you mentioned picture books. Also, I think we've, in this first part of talking about just addressing reading with teens, what's coming through for me so much is this idea of companionship.
Yeah.
Whether we're reading together, out loud, whether we're trading a book back and forth, whether we're letting them recap the book for us, whether it's just the discussions, and you've done kind of the prep on your own. The key here is this companionship reading process. When you described your buddy reading system that you had with Dylan, that's a book club. That's what I show up for every Monday night to discuss the week's reading, and the leader sends out questions. I mean, it's so it's so Brave Writer coded.
I love
he has no idea. The sticky notes. I keep thinking about that, Dawn. That's just genius. Okay, so this is great. Well, okay, so a lot of the books that we want our kids to read, or that may be sort of on deck for them, have been made into movies. Especially if they're classics, and there might be movie versions of them. And I know this is a question that parents come to with sometimes, book first, movie first? Does the movie spoil the book? What happens if it's adapted differently? I have thoughts about that. I'm sure you
Yeah.
do too.
Yeah, there's no one right way to go about this question. What's really fascinating to me is that I don't know, I don't think it is this way anymore, but there was a time when it was like there were some pretty hard lines about you got to read the book before you watch the movie. I think that's softened a bit over the years. And here's what softened it for me that was really interesting is that my oldest, who we haven't talked about, but I do have another child. So my oldest is 22 now, going to be 22. Oh my goodness. And is autistic and really has a hard time visualizing, like taking words from a paragraph from, you know, a whole chapter and kind of creating those pictures in their mind. And so watching the movie first and also does not care about spoilers. Like, please spoil it for me so that I can relax when I read. Like, Theon wanted to know what is the plot? Who are the characters? What's happening here? Like, give me the short burst so that I can get on with actually enjoying this read because it was too stressful to not know what's going to happen next. It was too stressful to not understand like where this story was going and then also have to kind of bring those images of the characters to mind and all this kind of stuff. So yes, a movie is someone else's interpretation of the story, but some people find it really helpful to kind of have those visual hooks to hang on to and to understand the plot and understand the setting and so many other aspects of it so that when they do read the book, they can kind of relax a little bit and just really enjoy the language and enjoy how the story unfolds in the book, and then do some of that comparative interpretation and talk about some of the differences, why they may have changed something, if that change was actually helpful because of the visual medium, or if it distracted from the story, if it was necessary, unnecessary. All those things start to come about, but it really doesn't matter which one comes first, book or movie. I think parents are really nervous that if they let their teen or their kid watch the movie, then they'll be like, oh, I don't need to read the book now. But that's okay too. We'll talk about that.
Uh, it's been really fun to chart my own broadening of perspective on this issue over the, I guess, 25 years that I've been a homeschooling mom, because I definitely started out with a very almost rigid, like the book must be first. And Scott and I are both wired to be anti-spoiler, but experience has taught me that this is a spectrum, and not just different people falling in different places on the spectrum, but different books and different points in your lives fall in different places on this book first or movie first spectrum, and this spoiler or no spoiler spectrum. Emma, which I recently just finished listening to on audio with my 19-year-old, after I have lost track of how long it took us to listen to the Emma audiobook. We started it reading it, and it wasn't going well for Kelly. And then we started watching the movie. I was like, you know what? Let's just watch the movie first. And we watched the Gwyneth Paltrow version. And then we started watching all of the different iterations of Emma and spent like 2 years. This is over the course of 2 years of watching these movies and starting to listen to the audiobook and having intense discussions about scenes that were left in or were left out and characters and how this was played and how that was played. But really, it was movies first for the longest time because we're moving very slowly through this audiobook, because we were listening like only on 1 hour on Saturday nights, and not every Saturday night because other stuff would happen sometimes. So that's why it took so long. Also, we got halfway through the first time of this audiobook and decided that we didn't really like the narrator. And I had found out that Juliet Stevenson, who plays one of the characters in the Gwyneth Paltrow version of the movie, was the narrator. So we started over. That's why it took us so long. Through that experience, she could not have been more excited, going from being pretty like not enthused about the book at the beginning of our time with it to knowing every wrinkle of it. We finally finished the book 2 weeks ago, the audiobook, and she went out and bought herself a copy because now she wants to read it in print, and she wants to start all the movies over again because now we have all these insights of things that we think the book does that the movie didn't convey. None of the movie versions conveyed. So that's one example of like, there is a way that it enriches the experience. With The Lord of the Rings, which was the movie that like Scott and I fell in love, or the book, I mean, that Scott and I like at a party talked all night about The Lord of the Rings in college, and we're joined at the hip from that day forth. We were adamant that even though we love the movies, we wanted the kids to read it or hear it aloud first so that they would have their own pictures in their heads.
Right.
And I think that lasted all the way through until kid number 6.
You're like, okay.
Scott may have read it out. I can't remember. Anyway, the point is like, there are many, many other books that we chose to do movie first as an entry point.
Yeah. And that Emma experience really talks about how, you know, if you had been really hard line about like, no, you have to read the book first, it just would have killed Emma. You know, like poor Emma would be in the dustbin of books and probably would not have, you know, there would have been a resistance for the longest time.
Right. Right.
So by leaning into this idea that there are different entry points to stories and to the ways we consume stories. I mean, it may even be a YouTube video that gives a recap of the whole entire story.
Yes.
As an entry point to like, okay, let's just lower the bar here. Let's just get into the conversation with the book. Like, let's get into the cultural conversation with the book. Like, what are other people talking about? Why is this even a worthwhile title? Like, why should we even consider reading it? Like, maybe we need to go read some reviews. Maybe we need to go have some other entry point to this text other than just, you know, mom says you should read it because it'll look good on your transcript, you know, like it'll look good on your book list when you go to apply to university. Like,
why is this
not a good buy-in?
It's not. Well, and I think that's the key, right? Is going to our kids and giving them a voice in what do you like? Would you rather know the plot outlines before you start? I mean, a lot of us introduce Shakespeare to our kids that way, and we don't really worry about spoilers, right? We read the Charles and Mary Lamb, you know, story versions or some other story
Garfield, Shakespeare story versions.
Graphic novels of Shakespeare.
Absolutely.
Like, we go into it with some understanding of the major events of the story to help them, because we know for many younger readers, the language is going to be a hurdle. So we're giving them some tools for engaging
some
first.
Scaffolding to really engage with the text in a way that feels doable instead of just overwhelming.
Right. But it's interesting that even for someone like me who was on board with that, then you know, come to Jane Austen's or Dickens and I'm like, read the book I was like, you know, in my 20s, we're talking. I
know.
Barely out of my teens myself.
Well, and I think sometimes we just go along with these things until we question them and go, why?
Right.
If you're like me, you probably want to harness that back-to-school energy that you see in your kids when you kick off in the fall. That's when I would pick a big project to tackle with them because they still had a lot of energy. We've got classes like world building, which really appeals to gamers, writing the short story, essay prep dynamic thinking, middle school writing projects, Brave Writer 101, our main course when you're just getting started with us, Story Switcheroo for your little kids, and even something like script writing for those kids who want to write the next best Netflix show. Check us out. I think you'll find that these classes pay dividends all year. Once your kids experience being read and valued for their self-expression, they'll want to see if they can have that effect on you. We see ourselves as a great antidote to the rise of ChatGPT. Check the show notes for a link, and we hope to see you in an online class with Brave Writer.
I told this story a couple of weeks ago on the podcast. I referred to the ham in the pan story. Do you know that old anecdote? the point is that there's a family tradition of cutting off the ham
Oh,
before you roast it, before you put it in the pan. And then like finally you ask grandma and grandma's like, yeah, my pan was too
it was
small.
too small.
And it's, I think, really easy for us. Listeners who just heard me tell that story like 3 weeks ago, I don't regret telling it again because it is so easy for us to become locked into this is the way we do things. And especially if we have more than one kid and we're like, well, this is what worked for this set of kids or this child. Or even this is what worked when you were 10.
Or this is what worked for me. When I was in high school, I loved Jane Austen.
Right.
And now I'm going to impose that love on you.
So asking ourselves, like, wait, am I trying to stuff this experience into the wrong size pan? Or am I cutting off part of this experience because I'm really attached to this pan I've been using for a long time? Yeah. It's so good for us to think about and to invite our teens into that conversation. Do you like spoilers? Do you like cliffhangers? Do you like just to know who the characters are? Do you want just a cast of characters before we engage upon a read of this book that has 87 of them? Do you want to go back and forth? You know, with Hamlet, we would read a scene together and then watch it. And then sometimes we're like, oh, let's just keep watching for a while and then go back and read the scene. And we sort of leapfrogged that way.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah, it was really fun. The Andrew Scott version of Hamlet. Oh, my goodness. We found it on YouTube, just the To Be or Not to Be monologue by chance when we were looking for something else. And I have never been so riveted by a performance in all my days. And
I'm going to have to check it out.
Yeah. Oh, incredible. Okay. So part of what we're touching on, or we're talking around in that, goes to like what books make it onto the list in the first place. And that goes to all sorts of questions about, okay, my teen likes to read in a particular genre. They only like fantasy. How do I get them to read, realistic fiction or historical? Or vice versa. My teen hates fantasy, but I think that whatever, would be really worthwhile for them. And other decision points that occur when we are navigating the choice and curating the books that our kids are going to read while they're in high school with us, in charge of their education.
Right. Yeah. So there's a couple, there's so many approaches to this question. I think there's some teasing out there. There are kind of like books that they're reading on their own. And, of course, we hear in the news, there's a reading crisis. So, how much are our teens reading for enjoyment and how much are we like assigning to them and imposing reading on them? And how does that all come out in the wash? And I think it's kind of interesting. I was asking, so my son he homeschooled all through high school. He homeschooled pretty much all through school. He had a year and a half that he did in elementary. But I was talking to him recently about his experience. He did, for lack of a better term, it's a great books program for his first year at university. So he did a lot of reading and, had to write an essay every 2 weeks and just lots of reading and like Socratic discussion, small group type work. And so I was talking to him because one of the things that kept happening when he was in high school is I would say, it'd be really good for you to read this book. And he'd be like, well, why do you want me to read that book? And I'm like, well, it comes up like it's one of those like cultural, books that people will reference and it would be really good for you to have read it. And he's like, yeah, I never hear anybody talk about that book. I'm like, well, in your current circles, maybe nobody's talking about it, but when you get to university, then somebody's going to mention it. And so it was kind of fun. Like now that he, he's gone through university, he's getting ready to go back next week. And so recently we were talking about it and he's like, yeah, nobody mentioned those books you were talking about.
Oh, that's hilarious.
And he was in a program that, with students, a very high caliber program of students who went through private schools. And some of the kids he's going to school with, their private school tuitions were more than their university tuition. These are not slacker kids who weren't reading. So anyway, it was really kind of interesting to get his feedback for his high school reading experience. I was really open to having him select a lot of his reading and things that were on his book list. And then he did a lot of reading on his own that were like things that probably wouldn't, that we actually didn't put on his book list. So I think when a parent is kind of analyzing, well, what would I like my teen to read? Like, what do I think is important for them? Somebody recently asked, like, well, what are those formative texts, that like all students should read? And I was really putting a lot of thought into it because I thought, there was a time when there was, this literary canon that felt like, everybody's reading these books. You really, you should read these books. And I think that the explosion in publishing has provided us with so many options and so many more voices and so many stories that there's absolutely no way that we can narrow down to just a handful of books that, like every high schooler should read. I occasionally will look up those lists, like because I pick the books for the Boomerang and it's always kind of interesting. And I'm curious to see, like, what are people saying about books? What are conversations around books? And so, there's always those kind of classic ones that pop up, but there are modern classics now that pop up, and there are really beautifully written, wonderful stories out there that from people that didn't have opportunities to get published in the past or are less likely to get published in the past. So now we have this buffet, this feast of literature that we get to choose from, that our teens have access to and can choose from. So when I think about this idea of like compiling a book list for our teens to choose from, there are way more books that we're going to put on that list than our teen has time to read in high school. Like, when you think about it in terms of like time investments, like we were talking about, like how long an audiobook is. You look at your apps where you get audiobooks and you're looking at it, you're like, oh, that's 8 hours. That's 10 hours. That's 25 hours.
Right.
That's 30 hours. And so when you think about that, you're like, that's a lot of time to invest in reading. We want them to also enjoy reading so we don't absolutely kill it. So when I think about compiling a book list for our teens, there are 3 points that I recommend parents really consider as they're thinking through this feast of options that they have. Looking at each individual book, and I'll expand on these in a minute, but looking at each individual book and author, looking at the year-long list, like over the course of the year, what are they going to be reading? And then the reading diet kind of the teen over the course of the whole entire span of their, maybe their high school years. So it's kind of from this very narrow perspective of evaluating the actual book all the way to evaluating the diet as a whole, of their reading diet as a whole. So the first question that I typically ask a book is, why does the book deserve to be on our list? That is a great question.
Right.
I think it touches on what we talked about earlier, where, we feel like sometimes we're just doing something, we don't really analyze why we're doing it. You always have to read the book before you watch the movie. Okay. Well, this book, every teen should read this book. Well, really?
Right.
Let's think about that. So why does this book deserve to be on the list? What does it represent? Who does it represent? What story is it telling? Where does it fit into the things you want your teen to get from literature? What's the story that the book is telling? Is the author from the community that is represented in the book? And if they're not, doesn't mean that you can't use the book, but then it takes some more analyzing, looking at reviews from the community that's represented in the book. How do they feel about how they were represented?
Right. And that can so enrich the discussion that you're having about it.
Right.
About the book. Like that might wind up being the best and most enriching part of the experience for a kid.
Absolutely. Right. That just layers on these riches of discussion. You can talk about, like, maybe the reason why you want your teen to read this book is because it's from a certain time period, and that ties in with your history curriculum, or it ties into some other thing that you're studying. But are there other books, like we've talked about? There's so many more books out there that have been published since the, classics, quote unquote. So are there alternative books? And then the other question that comes around is, does your teen absolutely need to read the book in its entirety? So that stems from the question of like, does this book deserve to be on the list? Why do you want your teen to read it? If it's just for kind of that cultural literacy, so that, when somebody mentions the book in casual conversations, they have a touchstone to be able to respond to, then maybe the teen doesn't need to read the book from beginning to end and spend 15 to 20 hours of their time reading the book. maybe what they need to do is watch the movie and read some excerpts from the book, or watch, my son, even when we were having a conversation, he's like, Mom, if somebody mentioned a book I haven't read, all I have to do is pull up a YouTube video summary of it and just at least get the gist of it, and I'll know. And then if you want to read it, so many adults I've talked to say that, they have experienced where somebody's talking about a book, they don't know about it, and then it inspires them to go read it. It's okay, but if your reason for them to read it is simply so they have that cultural cache, so that they know what somebody's talking about, is that enough for them to spend all of this time and therefore not be able to read other books? So it's always a trade-off.
Right. Every yes means other no's.
Yeah. So drill down on your why. Drill down on your why. The other question is and this kind of ties back to not necessarily teen reading, but it can tie into teen reading, is, are there children's classics you want your children to read, but maybe not when they're children? Maybe some of these children's classics, like we talked about, even reading picture books with teen, maybe some of these children's classics are better to read in the teen years, so that they can truly critically think about them and analyze them through a more mature lens, where their rhetorical imagination has been developed and they can actually think through and critically analyze some of this literature.
I think Little House on the Prairie books are a perfect example of that. And I say that as someone with, a lot of Little House history.
You got a Little House history.
Just a little. Yeah, reading those with older readers and layering it in with other texts. Maybe we're reading Little House and Birchbark House. And maybe we're also reading Prairie Fires, an adult nonfiction book by Carolyn Fraser that contextualizes like what was happening in the country at the time that Laura wrote her books.
Right.
And what government programs they were part of, and how it was their movements were affecting others.
Right. And
on that land.
Discussions that can generate. So your teen is getting access to this cultural phenomenon of the Little House books, but they're getting it with all kinds of supporting text and contextualization for what those stories are, how they became, and the other aspects of culture that were happening during the time period and how they've evolved over time. So there's a lot of richness there that you're not going to be able to have those types of discussions with your 9-year-old.
And, if I could just inject, I know that sometimes parents have discomfort around that when it comes to classics of literature, especially ones that they have very strong, warm memories of themselves. Yeah. But I think it's interesting to notice that we don't actually often have that same level of reaction when we're talking about nonfiction. So I know that if I'm reading a book about a science topic, I'm kind of expecting that since the time, if it's a book that I read when I was a kid that was written about, I don't know, bacteria.
or the fact that Pluto is a planet.
Perfect example. Thank you. That's exactly what I was looking for.
Yeah.
I'm going to expect that we are going to incorporate a more contemporary perspective on that content now. Absolutely. Right?
Yes.
Even if there's a book where Pluto was called a planet, that is a wonderful classic.
Yes. But we need to acknowledge that Pluto has been demoted, even though Pluto was my absolutely favorite planet ever in grade 3.
So that's a perfect example. And I just want to inject that into the conversation just so that we can notice that we do sometimes feel really strongly when it comes to fiction.
Yes.
And we have a more measured or calm response to, of course, we're going to look at some contemporary updated takes on this idea now versus the encyclopedias that my parents got for me in the 80s, right?
Oh
Like
my gosh.
it's like buying an
Exactly.
old map, right? Of
Right.
so okay, I want you to continue with what you were saying, but I just think it's so great that we can know that, like, oh, yeah, I can actually interrogate my own response to, oh, I'm mourning like my own innocence.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and, we have often, some rose-colored glasses on about stuff that we read when we were younger. Certain nuances of those texts didn't get through to us, and we didn't necessarily have the people that were reading them aloud. I mean, I don't remember read-alouds. Read aloud wasn't a thing. I was on my own. So
That's
whatever I was
absolutely
reading,
right.
I
And that
was
is why I was reading like Flowers in the Attic. Um,
right. So I think that's a great example of how we can selectively sometimes feel like we can have commentary on texts that we want to push back on, but then other texts that are a little bit more, close to our hearts, we're like, oh, we can't bear to, push back on that, but it really needs a little nudge. So the first thing was really kind of interrogating the why for the individual book, and then looking at the whole year, like what does this year of reading look like for my teen? Whose stories are included? Is there a mix of authors, the communities and the voices that are being represented, and the genres? We have questions about, like what genres should my teen be reading? They only want to read fiction, or they only want to read fantasy. I mean, so should I push them over into, force them to read other things? Let's come back around to that piece. And then also there's a concept out there, the windows and doors concept. There's been other things added to it. But, how many books are windows for my kids to, like, for my teens to see into other ways of being? And then how many mirrors are they seeing? And then, like, do those mirrors represent positive aspects of our culture, or who we are as people? And so those are all things to really consider as you're building out kind of this year-long book list. And then looking at the book list as a whole, kind of like over 4 years of high school, what are the books that I'm hoping that my student reads? When I was talking with my son about his reading experience, and the fact that, there are always going to be what some people would call gaps in reading, like
yes.
there's certain iconic, classic texts that he didn't read. His takeaway really was that by letting him choose most of his high school reading and really lean into the things that were important to him to read and that were engaging for him to read, what it maintained was his actual love of reading. So we established that in the younger years by doing tons of reading aloud, by allowing him a lot of freedom to read books like Wings of Fire.
Right.
Like what some people might classify as twaddle, by instilling a love of reading and then helping your teen maintain that through the high school years. Then what happens is that they generally have a good feeling. And this is what he said. He generally has a good feeling about reading. So when it comes to tackling really harder academic texts, which he had to do a lot of last year, he could pull on those reserves that he had from just like, it's not reading. I really enjoy reading.
Right.
I genuinely do. Like, I have good memories of reading. It's not all terrible. I didn't have reading like put upon me, and didn't have subjected these books that I really did not want to read. And he ended up reading this first year in university books that he didn't want to read in high school. I actually asked him in high school if he would read Emma and that we could, watch the movie and read the book together. And he just flat out was like, I'm not interested. But it was an assigned text in university for him, and he read it. And he had discussions about it. And, he's glad that he did. I mean, we had some discussions about it. So it was like the timing was right. And he was able to pull from his good experiences and his positive experiences of reading so that he could dig into those texts. So I don't think there's a magic book list for teens. I think the magic comes by letting them really lean into the things that they're interested in, the genres that they're fascinated with, and then nudging them and pushing them with lots of scaffolding and support for the things that they're not as interested in. Like we talked about with movies, with graphic, even bringing in graphic novels for those scaffolding of longer stories.
Right.
Things like the Odyssey. Gareth Hines has great graphic novels for, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And
Yep.
to see that and to experience that before digging into these really tough texts, it's really helpful. And we are here to help our teens along, not to
Yeah, you're really hitting on, we need to examine our objectives, and we're going to have multiple objectives, and they're going to be different at different times.
Right.
So what is my objective? Well, I want this person to love reading.
Right.
And I want them to find reading like something that is pleasurable to do. So that sometimes is going to mean I need to meet physical needs, whether it's, they need a Kindle or an e-reader with a good font, and good lighting, whatever. Maybe I want to layer in some other kinds of physical experiences that make reading pleasurable. But also my objective is, as you said, to give a breadth of knowledge about that cultural literacy piece. And of course, I've got things that I think are the most amazing books ever, but so do you, and so does that person, and so does that person. There's many different objectives. I want you to be able to read something challenging and figure out how to grapple with it and how to get through it. I want you to be able to read and analyze and think about what is happening here, and is this narrator reliable, and what perspective is this writer bringing to the page, and the whole gamut of it. I want reading also to inform you as a writer and to give you some facility. So when thinking through those objectives, I'm finding that, I'm much less attached to the specific list of books.
Right.
It's not going to be the same list for every kid. It certainly hasn't been the same list for every kid in my family. The books that I read weren't the same as the books my husband read or the books that you read, right? And there are some common ingredients, books that pop up over and over again. But even just discussing why that is and how the canon came to be and who made those lists and how the lists are changing, that's where the riches are. So I think if we always can keep ourselves with that, what are my objectives here? Can I also let my teen make a new and different kind of reader out of me? Can we leapfrog? I pick one, you pick one.
Yeah. And I really think that leans into the collaborative nature of this whole high school experience when it comes to homeschooling.
Yes.
I mean, that is the joy of homeschooling high school, is that you have these teens who can really lean into the things that are important to them and the things that light them up that they wouldn't necessarily get to lean into and explore if they were in a traditional schooled high school. So that's collaboration, I think, was one of the key features of high school for us. And, creating these book lists, and Dylan would add things he's interested in reading, and I'd add things. And, same with Fionn when Fionn was going through, and even Fionn and I even sometimes will listen to books together and read together. In fact, Fionn and I just went camping together, and Fionn was read the opening chapter of a Star Trek book to me when we were camping. So, here I have a 22-year-old and we're doing read-alouds while we're camping.
Fantastic.
But that's letting go of some of this preconceived notions that we have around books, and knowing that instilling at the very least, not a hate of reading. I mean, not every kid is going to love reading. And sometimes, being more open to letting them select books. I mean, one of the features that I love about the boomerangs, because we're talking about teens, and the slingshots, is that you mentioned earlier, we do write them as if we're writing to the teen.
Right.
I joke that one of the things that I do most as an editor is add questions. Because if you've used the dart or the arrow, when you leap up to the boomerang and the slingshot, you'll notice there's a lot more literary analysis and writer's craft, and looking at the authors and bringing in author interviews and really digging into their craft and what they've got going on. And I think there's a lot of fodder there for teens and discussions. And so if there is a book that you're like really hard set on wanting your teen to read, getting a boomerang or slingshot to go with that can help kind of carry that load a little bit and give them some buy-in and some hooks to hook into, because we do like beyond the passage boxes and inside scoop boxes that tell a little bit about either the genre or the writer or the time period. And there's all kinds of little entry points that we helped kind of pull them along. And I think that that can be really helpful too. So
those are tremendous resources. And like, I would be inclined if I had a kid who was in college and was having to write a paper and was stumped on a topic, and for a book, it's Emma, right? And there's a boomerang for it, to say, well, this is going to give you lots of jumping off points and ideas, and also for books that I myself might not be able to drop everything and read right now, but that can give me some scaffolding so that I can be the support person as you read that book or navigate through having to write about a book. I think that makes those like really versatile tools in a lot of different applications.
Right. Yeah. And the boomerangs and slingshots all have think piece questions that are built in. So they're, for a lack of a better term, comprehension questions, but they're really not. They're definitely like conversation sparks, and they're things. They give students things to react against and to dig into and have discussions about. And then also, even if they wanted to use them as writing prompts. So we just have riches upon riches inside those guides that I think are phenomenal.
Well, Dawn, I know you and I could talk about books all day long. There's so much more that we could talk about, but I think we have given folks a lot to think about. And I would really love to hear from you, our podcast listeners, like what questions are on your mind about navigating this whole area of reading and book selection with your kids, especially your teens. What are your challenges? What questions do you wish we had tackled here today? Because we can do it again.
We could. I have a couple topics we could come back to.
I know we could do a whole part 2 just from right this minute.
So if you guys want a part 2, let us know.
Yeah,
we'll
let us know
on the mic.
Well, Dawn, thank you so much for pinch hitting with me today. I always enjoy our conversations.
Thank you.
And now I guess I better go get to work on my next dart.
That's right.
My editor, she'll be waiting.
Tick tock, tick tock.
Well, thank you for listening, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Okay, that's another Brave Writer episode in the books. Thanks for joining Melissa and me today. We love it when you leave us reviews, when you send us comments via text message. We read them all. We also couldn't do this show without our fabulous production team at Nova, or Jeanette Hall, the Brave Writer team member who handles all those administrative details you know nothing about. In the meantime, we hope that you have a fantastic week. Keep going, think well. We're rooting for you.